Assalamu alaikum, this is Brother Hameed back again with the Muslim Empowerment Institute. So today I want to give some thoughts on this situation going on with the anti-Somali sentiment that's been increasing here lately due to the incendiary comments made by Mr. Trump, where the beloved president suggested that the Somalians have ripped off Minnesota due to fraud schemes with these nonprofit organizations and daycare centers, along with a lot of them supposedly not working, but they're receiving government assistance. Allegedly, a disproportionate amount of Somalians receive government assistance in Minnesota compared to other groups there. That I don't know. And he referred to Minnesota Congressman Ilhan Omar, a Somali refugee, as garbage and other Somalians as garbage. And he doesn't want them in America, and he wants them to go back to where they came from, right? Now, he said some other inappropriate things too about the country of Somalia, which is in East Africa. But first, it's hypocritical to allow white so-called refugee South African colonizers to come to America, and they were small in number because it was said that the native population of black South Africans were perpetrating a genocide against their colonizers, which was all a lie. So you see, they're not consistent with this attitude that they have toward people who immigrate to America. You know, we're against immigration, but we'll make an exception if the people coming to America are white. And even in this tirade against Somalis, the guy said, Trump said, why can't we get people from places like Sweden and Norway to come to America? So you see that this whole thing, even with abducting the Hispanic folks and other minorities that may be undocumented or have some immigration issues, it's all about, quote unquote, making America great again, which is a code phrase for reinstating or sustaining a white numerical majority in America or maintaining white supremacy. That's what it's all about. So just to give the history on why so many Somalians are in America, they had a civil war going on in Somalia in the early 1990s, and the people who weren't involved in the civil war, the victims, sought resettlement to other places. This country, the US of A, has been doing bombing campaigns in Somalia for a quarter of a century. So you can put a lot of the blame on the US for contributing to a refugee crisis. Same thing in Venezuela. Why does everyone want to come to America? Because they have some type of conflict in their own country, whether it was war or economics, and they want to escape it. It's really simple as that. And this happens all over the world. When you want to take down a country and you don't want it to appear like you're the one who took them down, all you do is find some rebel groups in that country with weapons or whatnot, and then you install who you really want to be in charge so that the puppet leader will deliver the resources of that country back to the US. That's how it works. The previous leader in such and such country is deemed corrupt. He's starving his own people, or he's killing his own people, or he has weapons of mass destruction. Or in the more recent case with Venezuela, they're supposed to be exporting drugs to America, right? And some fishermen got blown to bits just to show the president of Venezuela that we mean business and we want that oil. So, that's the whole game, pretty much. Or they'll have a false flag type of attack or something to galvanize support to go eliminate people halfway across the world. So these Christian religious charities and liberal-minded whites in Minnesota were on this mission to help displaced Somali refugees, and they were welcoming to them. They helped Somali refugees with housing and jobs, and they helped put their kids in school. And you'll see a lot of African refugees in places like this with these terrible climates like North Dakota and Nebraska, and in this case, Minnesota, which is a tundra, like one of the coldest places in America. And they put them in these places where a lot of people may not really want to be. And they need the labor force for jobs so their economies won't crash, right? So you notice how they don't have a lot of minorities in these places. So certain unpopular states will allow refugees to come in. Now, if you come up on the good thing where you have people giving you all these nice perks and stuff, and they're not asking for anything in return, then naturally you're going to tell your countrymen back home, and they're going to want the perks as well. So the message spread across Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and other places, even other places in America, saying that Minneapolis, Minnesota is the promised land for Somalis, a place of hijra, a place of refuge for Somalis. So you even had Somalis from European countries move to Minnesota, and over time the Somali population began to really explode really quickly. Now, they had family sponsorships, reunification programs, student visas, and other paths for Somalis to get to Minnesota, which became the global hub of the Somalian diaspora. If I was Somali and I could handle the cold, I would try to get up there too. So slowly, the neighborhoods in Minneapolis started changing. Maybe if you're not Somali and you live in an apartment in downtown Minneapolis, your neighborhood starts to resemble Mogadishu, a place in Somalia. You feel out of place. You think these, people have taken over your neighborhood, and you decide to move, and they move in another Somali person in your place. Then the grocery stores started selling Somalian food ingredients and products. The restaurants started selling Somali food. Clothing stores started selling traditional Somali clothing. So a Somali person can move to Minnesota, and you may not even have to learn English if you don't want to, because on every corner you can find someone who can speak your language and knows your culture and your religion. So there's less of an imperative to assimilate because there's really no need to. And it quickly becomes very comfortable for a Somali person to live, but maybe no longer as comfortable or familiar anymore for a non-Somali person. So this is what people are flipping out about. So Minnesota no longer became a place where Somalis can live. It became New Somalia, but in America. And you'll have the next generation who will be more active. They'll be more civically and politically engaged. They'll gain power politically, economically, and eventually they will probably lead in Minnesota. They already have a Somali woman who's the mayor of a city up there. Somalis on the city council, already mentioned the congressperson. So they're making moves. Meanwhile, the white liberals in that region are not getting married and they're not having kids. So Somalis will probably in the future replace the white people there as well as replace the black Americans in Minnesota. Now you see what's happening in other parts of the country. White people ain't having kids, but Hispanics are having a lot of kids. And instead of white guys who are concerned about the brownification of America try to convince white women to reproduce, they're taking out their anger and frustration on the brown people. And I think that's the number one reason why many whites voted for Trump. Everything else was secondary. That was his number one campaign promise of having the largest deportation of illegal aliens out of America, which in reality, as of today, they've only deported less than 500,000. So they're probably not going to be very successful in this whole thing. These folks were convinced that undocumented people were an existential threat to their existence in America, socially, politically, economically, and culturally. Now, I noticed that they have some black Americans who have mimicked the rhetoric of the whites that are in opposition to Somalians. So they're targeting the hate that was perpetrated against them and retargeting the hate that was perpetrated against them and aiming it at the Somalians. So it's so much for Pan-Africanism. That pipe dream has been dead in the water for a long time. There's very few black Americans that know anything about Africa, but they primarily view Africa or Africans as just another immigrant group that has capitalized off the struggles of black folks in America. Then they'll say, these folks have the audacity to look down upon us, right? Sometimes they'll use the same racial slurs against black Americans that white people use, and using some of the slurs in their own language. So I'm not seeing much support from black folks for Somalians with this whole Trump Somali backlash thing. So they're just saying things like, well, you're saying you ain't black. You definitely know what it's like to be black now, right? And back when they still had Jim Crow laws, which was government-sanctioned institutional racism, the propaganda from whites was that black folks are going to take the jobs that belong to white people. So a similar thing is happening now, except black folks and whites finally have something that they can agree on, right? And some groups from the African continent migrate to America, and like I said, they may look down upon black Americans. They say, you people have been in this country for hundreds of years, and many of you are in poverty, uneducated, out of wedlock births, living in crime-ridden communities, so on and so forth. And that may be true, but you have to educate them on the history of America. The Native Americans, the indigenous people in this country, were essentially genocided. Same thing that's happening in Palestine. It's the same thing that happened in this country with the Native Americans, right? How many Native Americans have you seen walking around before? Probably not a whole lot. Then it took 100 years for black people to receive so-called human rights with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in which white women, immigrants, and even the LGBT community people benefit. Slavery ended in 1865, by the way. And black folks pulled themselves up out of slavery during Reconstruction after slavery ended. You had several autonomous, thriving black communities in Memphis, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood in Florida, Wilmington, North Carolina, Elaine, Arkansas, and several others. And angry, jealous of their success, whites burned down all of these communities and killed the people, men, women, and children. They used to send postcards with whole families of people hanging from a tree. They were lynched. Racial terrorism was celebrated. They were proud of it. It was an all too common scenario where you would have a black person who opened a successful business or registered people to vote. Next thing you know, they're burning down the business along with the business owner. And they did this stuff to their black Christian brethren. Christian on Christian racial terrorism and genocide. And we hope that this type of stuff doesn't happen to any other group ever in America. Then you fast forward to the 1960s. Many of our black leaders were martyred for the movement. People like Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, MLK, Fred Hampton, and the ones that they didn't kill were either locked up in prison or they paid these so-called black leaders to associate the black human rights movement in America with LGBT people and other groups, therefore diluting the struggle and their efforts. And these black leaders who were killed did not sacrifice their lives so Steve can marry Robert and for Kevin to cut off his privates because he said he was born in the wrong body. Malcolm X didn't intend to die for this, right? Then you fast forward to the 1970s. You had abortion clinics in all of the low-income neighborhoods. 20 million black babies were eliminated in the womb since 1973. Then if a woman was on welfare, they incentivized her to not get married because they would cut off her government assistance. And a culture of single motherhood was created with these government programs. A culture that told women, specifically women of color, that you don't need a man. A man is a burden. So this stuff still continues today. Now this brainwashing and conditioning is being spread to really everyone. Look at the drugs that were put in black and brown communities in the 1980s. Then in 1994, the president at the time, Bill Clinton, signed a crime bill that mass incarcerated black and brown people. It made it to where possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine, which was a cheap drug that black folks did, was equivalent to 500 grams of powdered cocaine, which was very expensive, done mostly by white people. And the bill had mandatory sentencing, even if it was your first offense. Drug offenders made up the majority of the federal inmates throughout the 1990s. Drug offenders. And you know what else? In the 1990s, the powers that be, the people who are doing the massacre in Palestine, endorsed music, gangster rap music, that promoted selling drugs, doing drugs, drinking alcohol, sleeping around with a bunch of women. And lastly, black on black homicide, which encouraged young black youth to go to prison, in which the prisons were being invested in by the same record company owners who distributed this type of music. So this is how they took out black folks in America. They didn't have to lynch black folks anymore. They just changed their culture and made them lynch themselves, essentially. So before immigrant groups want to look down on black folks, at least they can know some of the history of what actually happened. Maybe still they'll look down on black people, on us, right? Now, to my Somalians, I see that they've been harassing them in Minnesota, and they bore the brunt of many internet jokes. Now, all you got to do is build more businesses and keep your money circulating in your community. Get educated, get married, reproduce, and address the social issues going on in your community with the gangs, the drug abuse. Nourish your Muslim identity before your tribal or ethnic identity, and you will outdo the people that's hating on you in no time. And educate yourselves on the history of black people and the indigenous people in America. Because if it wasn't for the civil rights movement, I don't think immigrants from non-European countries would have been able to come to America. And that's all I got to say. Like, share, and subscribe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.